So it's good to see everybody. This is so we had all kinds, our cat had all kinds of good things we could have chosen to do a panel on this year. This has been a very interesting, to put it mildly, year is for this issue. But after a great deal of thought and deliberation, we decided to dedicate this to the federal budget cuts and federal policy changes that have resulted in the last, not almost 365 days, not quite, but so here we are. I'm going to introduce myself first. My name is Melanie Blow. I am the vice president of RRCAHT, and I'm one of the founding members. And in my day job, I'm the executive director of the Stop Abuse Campaign, which is an organization that is all about preventing childhood trauma and abuse and helping those affected by it. So there's obviously a very significant tie-in to this issue for me. Um, so now I'm gonna just, if you guys would all like to introduce yourselves. Andy, since you're where you are on my screen, I'll call on you first.
All right. Yeah, my name is Andy Carey. I'm a community social worker. I'm the co-founder of MC Collaborative. Been on a lot of different initiatives. Most of our work is focused on really marginalized folks living in extreme poverty, usually with substance use, mental health issues, homelessness. And really came into this work, occasionally we'd have people trying to escape trafficking and come into our shelters or run into us on the streets and having difficulties serving them properly. And then when COVID hit, I guess that was March of 2020 now, that April we just started walking all over the community, same day, same time, every week, and we haven't stopped since then. So I spend a lot of time on Lyle Ave in North Clinton, where we run into a lot of trafficking issues, and just really became interested because our systems don't seem to match that level of trauma very well, and really wanted to be more helpful. So that's me. I guess I'll next on my screen is Keith, so I'll head that way.
Okay.
All right. Hi, all. I'm Keith Beer. I'm a retired investigator with the Grease PD. I retired in 2023 and I went to work for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children on their Team Adam, which is retired investigators that go out and assist with child abduction cases. I kind of learned more about human trafficking then. I worked also for the Monroe County Sheriff's Office in their human trafficking intelligence. And I teach now for St. John Fisher, and I teach a class in human trafficking.
Okay. Gabriel?
Hi everyone, my name is Gabriel Marcano. I am the Anti-Human Trafficking Program Coordinator at the Worker Justice Center of New York. Our work focuses a lot on labor trafficking, but we do support all kinds of human trafficking victims. As part of the work that we do, I'm also part of a couple of task forces in New York State. I help lead the Western District Human Trafficking Task Force and the North Country Human Trafficking Task Force. And of course, here with the Rochester Coalition, we've worked together for quite some time. We've been part of operations and helping clients and all kinds of stuff. So very happy to be here.
Okay, excellent. Um, first question. So again, we're talking about, just because there's been so much buzz, and I think all of you guys are going to have an awful lot to bring to the discussion of the federal budget cuts and policy changes that we saw within the last 365 days. So for just, jump in. We don't, this isn't like high school debate or anything like that. There's no buzzers. Just try to keep this conversational. So, what was the first change that any of you saw in your jobs after the cuts started last year?
I'd be happy to jump on that. So we actually a lot of it just at the beginning of last year became almost like all the secondary issues that came with the idea of changing policies and changing regulations. So Almost immediately, there's more fear in our workforce. So we have a bunch of staff that, of course, are concerned of whether or not they'll have employment. And then the community itself has a great deal of fear of whether or not, am I going to qualify for a SNAP? Am I going to have food? Is my subsidy going to disappear? And then the workforce itself has to spend a tremendous amount of time meeting and strategizing and figuring out how they're going to react to certain policies that could or could not happen. And so immense amounts of person power is going into just trying to figure out what we would do if something does happen. And so it felt like a year of just consuming so much time and energy trying to figure out what we could do. And then when we saw some actual facts on the ground, like when SNAP was stalled out for a little bit, and you realize that 36,000 people may not have their food enhanced, that's really intense feeling. And then you realize how real it can really get in this coming year. And so that was part of ours. We have grant funding at the federal level, as well as county, city, and state. And our federal program is all harm reduction, diversity. It's through SAMHSA, and it's likely that it will be cut in this coming year. So just knowing that those types of things. And that program, we actually help, I guess it's about 60 of the most chronically homeless individuals maintain their housing because it's difficult to move in and stay. So those folks will no longer have those supports.
Yeah, I mean, I could say that my role was 100% OVC funded, which is a federal grant. So that was definitely scary for quite some time. We literally didn't know what was going to be the future of our program in Worker Justice Center. This program has existed actually pretty much since the creation of the TVPA. The director of the program, Renan, has been doing this work for that many years. Um, so the program has managed to survive, and we didn't know if for the first time we were going to have to kind of pivot and not be able to have dedicated funding for our human trafficking work. We thankfully were able to get state funding, so that's what's funding the work right now. Um, and so certainly it was really concerning, and of course we serve a population that it's largely immigrants, non-citizens, um, Spanish speakers or non-English speakers. Um, and not only did we see that this with the funding cuts, but with the new opportunities for grants, a lot of those populations were not no longer prioritized. So it became challenging for us, and like I said, we were fortunate to have the state funding, but for some time we were also thinking about whether we would have to also change our priorities as a program, if we have to like figure out how to maybe at least get funding to work more targeting citizens and things like that. But so far we have been able to continue our work, in the way that we always have, serving a lot of farm worker populations. Right now, a lot of construction workers and all kinds of low wage workers. So that continues to be our priority, and again, largely immigrant populations.
Speaking on behalf of law enforcement, we've definitely seen some pretty significant changes. Key initiatives for human trafficking have been cut from the Department of State, Department of Justice, Department of Labor, Department of Health, and Homeland Security. Homeland Security and the FBI being the primary federal agencies involved in investigating human trafficking in the United States. I know the State Department slashed more than 70% of their workforce at the Office to Monitor Combat Trafficking Persons, what they call the TIP office. They're kind of a lead agency as far as the global anti-trafficking efforts. So 70% of their workforce was just eliminated, specifically to human trafficking. And a lot of these FBI and DHS agents have been reassigned now to deporting immigrants and things like that. So these cases just are not getting looked at. I mean, it was always an uphill battle to try to get these cases across the plate in the first place because they're very labor intensive. There's a lot of different moving parts. And, now without funding, without personnel, it's hit pretty hard.
Just something that dawned on me as you're talking about that, Keith. Um was sitting with someone from Homeland Security like last February, and she was talking about the exorbitant amount of time that her, shrinking office had to spend going through procedures and cutting out certain words that were now flagged federally. I'm like, oh my,
Yeah.
I would explode if that if that was
I would too.
happening
I
to
definitely
me.
would not be able to handle that as a retired guy. Yeah, and that's a
Yeah,
great point. I mean, little things like that, I wouldn't say little. I mean, they're huge issues. Like the State Department puts out the TIP report, the trafficking persons report.
right.
That hasn't been put out in the last couple of years. There was, kind of a newsworthy questioning of why this hadn't happened in 2025 because it's congressionally mandated that the TIP office release this annual report on the status of human trafficking
Hmm.
worldwide in June. And June went by, nobody heard anything. Finally it came out in September. It was posted to their website, and if you go to their website, if you want to look at the actual, you know, hard copy or PDF copy, it says, sorry, we're still working on it. And a part of that was not only, obviously they don't have the staff that they had, but also there was supposed to be an inclusion of the LGBTQ, because obviously that's one of our high risk
Hmm.
populations. So that was supposed to come out in this new TIP report, and it was completely scrapped, which is infuriating.
Hmm.
Yeah, it does. I mean, that's incredibly sad on the enforcement side of it. And then just in the general social service side of it, just that same kind of thing where you're spending time changing words or deciding whether your mission is going to maintain itself or move on. And yeah, and then to not get information. I think that's the really hard thing. So without that tip report, we're all kind of, we don't know.
Yeah.
And then you
Exactly.
can't write grants, you can't address problems if you don't have the
Hmm.
information.
Yeah, I mean, the tip report in the human trafficking world, I'm not going to say it was like New Year's Eve for us or anything like that, but it was a big deal. It was one of those things that it comes out and everybody reads it and people talk about it. And yeah, it's just, oh, this year they talked about this year they know, yeah, it is again, it's not super happy fun, but it is very important. And it used to be anyway, yeah, just a standardized thing that happened every year. It was a standardized set of metrics and information that you do use for figuring out exactly focus areas and grants and this and that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you think that, it's probably one of the key drivers of, policy that different agencies look at, from, the local all the way up to the federal government, looking at, okay, who are our target, vulnerable groups,
Right.
how are the criminals working? What's the process? Where's the money going? How can we disrupt money flows? Things like that. So that all kind of starts that ball rolling. Yeah, it's just kind of an overview, but it gets, it's something that you can put in front of your executives and say, hey, this is real. We need to start addressing this.
Right. And you can, highlight the important bits and all that. Because right, it's huge. It's not something most of us are gonna, read in an evening. But yeah, exactly.
I feel like data is already a very challenging, thing in the human trafficking world. Um, I know you mentioned, this isn't a debate. I'm glad this isn't a debate because I wouldn't want to debate Keith, knowing that Keith's a big data guy. And I am too, but we work together. So, which brings me to another like pretty immediate effect that this cuts had. We were working together with, some data projects, and doing work with the Western District Task Force. That's a task force that for many, many years has been funded by OVC and now is no longer funded.
Hmm.
So we immediately now have to figure out how to maintain the work of the task force with an unfunded model. but immediately affects the work that the task force was able to do, particularly having like dedicated law enforcement staff to process referrals. We're trying to maintain the survivor services aspect of the task force with all the agencies that have joined, but immediately affects that. It's going to immediately affect our capacity to quickly and effectively help victims, and that's something that we're already dealing with. So, I'm a big proponent of task forces. I feel like task forces are a really important way to gather data regionally, to figure out efforts regionally, and then kind of try to replicate that in other areas of the state. So we need more task forces. We should be funding more task forces. Not, it's kind of going backwards now with like task forces losing funding, and the Western District one was kind of like the example for other task forces in the state that now we're just trying to figure out how to keep the work going.
Yeah, and just one thing to mention about that is they because RCAT just joined that task force when it lost when it lost the funding. I mean, within a few weeks, which was just spectacular timing on our part. But yeah, the first thing everybody was saying was, "Oh, well, let's just keep it going as an unfunded model," and that sounds great. But for people in the not-for-profit world, you need to realize that everyone tells you, oh, just do one more thing. Just do one more thing. Let's just one more meeting, one more task force, one more this, one more that. And when there's no money for it, it doesn't always work. People do hit a limit. And especially when you're redacting words on all of your policies off your website, and especially when you're not sure if you're going to be employed in the next 3 months, it is a very it was a real loss. And the whole idea, oh, just be unfunded is not as simple as it sounds. It's not as effective as it sounds.
Yeah, I mean, immediate loss of resources. We had, there was a full-time coordinator position that just immediately it's not no longer there. So it's just, it adds a lot of challenges to be able to use the task force. So, yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate.
So next question is how did this round of budget cuts differ from previous rounds that you've seen before?
I think, as far as law enforcement goes, it's always kind of hit and miss. It's cyclical, I find, and it probably is for your agencies as well. As things raise awareness and people start talking about it more, they start talking to their legislators more, and obviously it trickles up, and then the money trickles down. Um, so it kind of comes in waves. I think probably around just after 2020 to 2022 was a big time. And a lot of different initiatives were put into place, which was great. Since 2022, I mean, if you go and you just look through a lot of the federal documentation, reports, things like that, you'll kind of see a drop off, for 2023 and 2024, and now 2025. So it's, you know, getting that information out and helping us to understand the problem and just raising awareness. It counts.
Yeah, I felt it was interesting coming out of COVID, you got kind of excited. You're like, oh, maybe we could solve homelessness and do some other things, because things were starting to roll along. There was a lot of flexibility. We were able to use a lot of evidence-based practices for housing and treatment and all that kind of stuff. And then it suddenly starts to disappear. And then now we haven't been hit as hard this first year in 25, but I think 26, a lot of the basic needs have just been cut out or made much more difficult. So if they come out the way people are saying, we'd be in real trouble. SNAP would be cut significantly. The ability for people to work 20 hours a week in order to get food, or volunteers, very difficult for a lot of folks. And then the HUD cuts, luckily they didn't do them this year, I think because it was a 2-year contract and they decided not to fight that. but it's going to dramatically change. We get about $17 million into our county for supportive housing for chronically homeless people, people escaping trafficking, all sorts of folks. And those programs have to change altogether because they're going away from the 80% of that money goes to permanent supported housing vouchers. Now it'll be like 20%. And right now our estimates are that's 660 households that'll be out in the street at some point in time, most of which have lots of trauma, lots of homelessness, so very difficult to house folks and keep in housing. But they'll just lose their subsidies, and everything will change. So right now it looks pretty scary. We'll see what actually happens, but yeah, the budget is going to be really critical, and then some of the bureaucracy of it. You know, if you really do make everyone reapply for food stamps in the month of February, it's just not possible. I know the food stamp workers, the SNAP workers over at DHS, there's not enough of them to do 36,000 applications in a month. You know, that's little things like that that are just impossible to do. So,
Yeah, I think with the just also using OVC as an example, that was I think some more new funding opportunities have been released more recently, but for a while we just weren't seeing a lot of the stuff that for many years was there in terms of funding opportunities. And like I said, we're still not seeing as much as there used to be in terms of being able to help non-citizens. So that continues to be a concern when it comes to federal funding. Just to be able to help non-citizens, we know that immigrants are a huge at-risk population for labor trafficking. So unfortunately, I think that we might continue to see that lack in federal funding for that. But thankfully, we do see at least in New York and other states that have are kind of trying to compensate for that with more funding opportunities for this type of work.
Yeah, to kind of piggyback on that, I noticed that too, Gabe. The DOJ's Office of Victims of Crime, they put out those funding, and I check it pretty regularly too. And I haven't seen anything. And I noticed just yesterday that there's a bunch that have been put out with deadlines for March 2026. So that's good, but it'll be interesting to see what the criteria are and what's actually awarded.
Right.
Because I know even the funding mandates and things like that, a lot of the things that typically would have been awarded repeated, have been awarded to different organizations over and over annually are not being given out. So it's scary.
Did you folks have any what were your expectations at the beginning of last year about what was going to happen?
yeah, I think that is just I think it was a little devastating. I feel like I kind of went two ways. So one was I thought, oh boy, the bottom's coming out. Federal funding is such an important part of our safety net systems, our everything we do. Um, so that was pretty scary because it just felt like it was going to happen pretty quick, and the marginalized would be the the folks most heavily hit by it. And then there was an optimistic side of me that kind of felt like, well, also Rochester's a pretty cool community. And maybe with state, county, and city funding and private, we can kind of be a haven for all the craziness, and really provide good services for people, good housing for people, and become kind of that bastion in the storm type thing. So, and I do see some of that happening. I mean, the state seems to be stepping in more and more to try and make sure things are okay, along with city and county. So, there is some hope to it too, as much as it feels disastrous when you look at the scope of the money, but also knowing that Rochester can do quite a bit on its own. And so maybe that'll be exciting and we won't have to be so dependent on it. So,
I think very quickly we had concerns about what the new administration, what these changes would mean, just with our ability to help victims. For example, investigations that usually a victim of trafficking that's a non-citizen can apply for immigration relief, but that has certain guidelines, including collaborating with law enforcement. So a lot of times that would mean for us collaborating with HSI to do these investigations, and that would kind of usually fulfill that requirement of collaborating with law enforcement. But one of the quickest things we saw was that not as much with funding, but like the reallocation of resources within Homeland Security that was away from HSI and to going to ICE. So everything was for ICE now. And then with everything else happening with ICE, that really, puts a lot of challenges for us to be able to work with Homeland Security at all because we have to protect our clients. We have to make sure that they're not going to get, they're not going to be targeted in any way. And then we saw changes with the T visa process, whether now there's like a risk of deportation if they get the T visa application denied. So uh, all those little things happening very quickly continue to be a huge challenge for us when it comes to trying to help victims that are non-citizens, and just to get them to speak out. I mean, this is something that's causing more victims to not want to come forward, not want to speak out because they're afraid. They're simply not very trusting of the process right now. So it's been a challenge for sure.
Just I want to go a little deeper into that. Have How successful have you folks been in being able to protect victims who are coming forward? Um, or and even what's working to get people to even come forward? Because I totally do understand how terrifying this is. How terrifying all this is for them.
Well, it's always an uphill battle to get people to talk to law enforcement. We're trying to change that culture, and it's crushing it. I mean, it's just making it somebody, and I'm sure Gabe, can absolutely speak to this, especially among the Latino community, and we've got a large number of those folks, and they, any inroads that we were trying to develop and say, show people that, hey, we're not immigration, we're here to help, um, and I can't blame them. They don't trust.
Yeah. Right. I used to be able, if I had people that I knew that I worked with, and going back to the task force, I knew that I could trust referral process in the task force for, victims' identities to be protected, but losing that, affects that as well. And I'm just not as able to promise a victim that if they come forward and they give their information to a federal entity, that they're gonna be protected. I can't anymore really make a promise of that kind, so it really affects things. So we've gotten a little bit creative in trying to now utilize more of the state agencies. So I feel like for now that seems to be sort of a path forward, because victims are just more likely to collaborate. So, for example, Attorney General, we're looking at maybe working more with DAs and stuff like that. So keeping it, with state agencies. But when it comes to the federal agencies, HSI, FBI, it's a lot more difficult to try to to make any promises to a victim and to get to convince a victim or try to get them to want to feel safe coming forward or collaborating with them or speaking with them.
Yeah, and I think on a much lower level than that, not the actual victim level, just in general as a social worker, um, ICE was granted access to Medicaid records this year, which has never happened in the past. And so I've spent years and years telling people that this is just for Medicaid. And because I'm asking demographic stuff, what's your ethnicity? What's your, race? And then also your diagnosis is in that. And then suddenly having it open to law enforcement agencies, very different. And so all that I've been saying in the past is no longer true, which is, of course, disturbing to me ethically. And now when I'm talking to people, I have to be more clear about that. Like people will see this data, not just your doctors, not just the people that are part of your care. And that's a really scary, that intimidates people to no end. It's a scary thing nowadays. So,
Yeah, the list of disclosures you have to give to a victim nowadays of all the risks involved with coming forward make it a lot more difficult to do this work.
yeah.
Oh wow. Yeah, I can only imagine because I mean trafficking victims are have been victimized multiple times throughout their life in multiple ways and times through the whole trafficking process. So yeah, I can only imagine how How difficult that's got to make it. Oh my goodness. Um, have you noticed any other consequences to cuts that weren't directed towards your specific field, but are starting to have an impact?
Like we were talking about before, just the willingness of people to come forward. And then the collateral things that come along with that, funding for victims of crime, things that we could make sure that people, when they do come forward, they can get some type of, uh, financial support and things like that. Like Gabe was talking about the T visas, those are for human trafficking individuals that may not have legal status in the country, but have been brought here and victimized when they report to, you know, law enforcement. We're able to send an application up to the federal government to say, hey, we'd like to get this person a T visa, which is a temporary visa that gives them status in the country for as long as the process goes on, and also helps to potentially, give them status beyond that as well. Um, and who's gonna sign up for that when you don't know if it's going to happen, and if it doesn't happen or if it's denied, you get sent away. So I mean, it's
Yeah, you
just
just put yourself at more risk.
right.
So, ugh.
I feel like one of the most disheartening things that we saw happening is everything that's affecting children right now. So obviously, right off the bat, unaccompanied minors and assistance that was usually there for them, um, which is a huge problem. We have a problem with unaccompanied minors who are exploited. Both in labor trafficking and in sex trafficking as well. But even with citizen children, that we have organizations who are dedicated to helping child sexual exploitation, who also were affected by funding cuts. There's an article by The Guardian that kind of goes in depth on this, and I was interviewed for this, and if you can Google it, it's just The Guardian, and the U.S. Department halts funding for human trafficking survivors. And it talks about that, and like all these agencies that some of them are dedicated, for children, for women, for all kinds of populations that have been affected and have had to either completely halt their operations or change the way they work.
Yeah, and I think that the mental health symptoms that come from all of this. So you're a lot of people, especially I'm glad you brought the children, parents are keeping them inside, keeping them isolated. People are hiding, people are kind of constantly looking over their back, and just that fear in general. Like a lot of people, that's just it adds up over time, and the trauma builds up of it. And that seems to be kind of a universal thing. In the trafficking world, there's always lots of fear, but now lots of people are fearful, even as citizens, to come outside and to do things and go to the store. So that kind of fear builds in a community, and it really affects individuals' ability to function, obviously. So
Yeah, yeah, I think I read that article as well, Gabe. I think they were saying that more than 100 different organizations that support victims of human trafficking have lost funding. I mean, that's insane to even think about. 100
yeah.
different organizations that are doing this, nationwide, and now they don't have funding. So these people are just getting left out in the cold.
Yeah, I was in my day job. I was going to apply. There was a grant that came out from, I think, DOJ that I was all set to apply for. And I would have used it to start a child sexual abuse prevention education pilot. I mean, nothing like controversial or anything. And then regime change and all the grants were frozen. They were gone, they were pulled for months. And then eventually they trickled back. And it was, just a whole different grant at that point. And like the one thing, a lot of things are striking about it, but one of them was you can't do any data collection. I'm like, we've been telling not-for-profits for generations need to do data collection. It's becoming a bigger and bigger part of everything we do. And then, nope, can't do it anymore. In other words, we don't really care if this is working. We just want to, give money to things that sound like they're good. This might the only thing I could come up with from that little change. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that's just one of those weird things that I don't think I was expecting. And the other thing I'm always telling the community is that things that help human trafficking victims most of the time don't have the word human trafficking associated with them. They need housing just like everybody else who can't work. They need medical care just like everybody else who can't work. They need food stamps. They need all this other stuff because there's pretty much a guarantee that there's a period of time that they're not going to be able to work. They're not going to be able to support themselves. And we don't have, and we, nor do we really, is that even the most efficient way to do things? Dedicated funding streams for them. They're, they have to get these services just like everybody else. And if those services aren't there, they're really suffering.
Yeah, and I think it increases the barriers. So we've worked so long to, lower the eligibility standards and barriers, especially for people who have had their IDs taken away from them, have had their, everything is different. And then you're unable to get through the system as well. And yeah, and then now the barriers are going up a lot quicker and you can't get to your basic needs. So that's
So are there any upsides? Have you seen anything, any changes or improvements or even just anything coming out of this mess that you do think is positive or could become positive?
Yeah, that's a tough one. But I guess I mentioned before, um, I think that this has gotten us to think more about how to kind of like protect ourselves and I mean the organizations from situations like this happening again in the future, and kind of learning that we can rely in administrations for this kind of work. So I am glad to see more state funding being allocated for things like this, and just more, people are thinking about this more and like, okay, how can we focus more on getting state funding and private funds? So, hopefully we'll see more of that, those like private grants available for this kind of work. Which, there's always also pros and cons with that. But I would say that that's one thing that this has forced us to figure out how can we do this work without relying on the federal government, and how much that changes, and how can we kind of like have a process that gives us a little bit more of a guarantee of continuation. So I think it's unfortunate everything we're dealing with, but now I feel like everyone's getting really creative and see how can we prevent this from affecting us in the future. So.
Yeah, I think I'd piggyback on that is the creativity that comes from it, kind of showing off our resiliency, but also knowing how in the future to affect federal level stuff and not allow things to happen to us so yeah, I do think, as a social worker, and especially because I primarily work on the streets and abandoned houses, shelters, that crisis is a great time for change, and so I look forward to things in that way. If I'm going to tell people that this is a good time to go a different direction, then I need to think that way too for us. And so, yeah, maybe some of the systems that weren't working for us, we can fix as they kind of are rebuilt, and some other things like that, and just creative new ideas on how to serve people. I think what's always been the hardest for me is when someone comes up to me on the street. Maybe they've been trafficked for a very long time. They finally want to get out of the life. They want to go to detox. They want to do these things. And actually, we just had a couple weeks ago a woman we sent to detox, and the detox didn't meant no harm, but a man staff was rounding at night to do the make sure everyone was okay. Walked into her room just to check off that she was there and okay and breathing, nothing big, scared her out of the rehab. Because all of a sudden there was a man in a room in the middle of the night and just didn't know, because it trauma informed, but not at that level. So those types of things, I think, as we rebuild, we can really think about how to serve people a little better. And so hopefully, out of the ashes, something good comes. I hate to see all the damage though being done. So that's
Yeah, I definitely think we're going to see some very long lasting repercussions. This is going to affect us for many years, in many different ways. And it's pretty sad. It's hard not to be negative, I think, in this time, but we got to keep our heads up and keep doing our job and keep doing our mission and do the best we can do it.
Yeah, I agree. And the one thing, like one one thing that impressed the heck out of me was as the snap, all the stuff was happening with Snap in November. New York State not only offered to help, but fast. I mean, New York State and fast are not words that go together in my mind very often. But that really did impress me. And then the county and the city and and private donors and all of that. And I mean, on the one hand, part of me was like, oh my gosh, I worry about this exhausting funds that are going to be used for other things, but it was still a beautiful thing to watch. And again, Governor Hochul's like, nope, we're not going to let that happen. Adam Bellows like, nope, we're not going to let people starve. And that was impressive to me. Um,
absolutely.
so what do you think next year is going to be like?
I'll tell you, my daughter is something of a budding human rights advocate, and when this administration changed, she was very doom and gloom. And I spent a considerable amount of time trying to talk her off the ledge, and hey, this is America. We see these types of things. It's cyclical. We won't allow these things to happen. And I am tired of eating crow because she has been crushing me, and I'm like, I got nothing, kid. I got nothing, and I don't know. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Yeah.
it's interesting that we talked about these new grants funding opportunities from what we see that Keith and I mentioned, and I mean that's reassuring to see. Again, I know we've talked about maybe we can't really rely too much on this federal funding anymore, but it seems like a lot of this stuff happened, and like human trafficking, which is kind of when people didn't realize what was going on, and then as groups like we're part of the Freedom Network, like we were very vocal about what was happening, and like raising these issues to Congress. So I think now this is what we're seeing some of like the aftermath of that is like being vocal about like this is affecting people. Hopefully we start seeing some changes from that, and like because this is an issue that was already overshadowed by so many other things that hopefully now that all these like coalitions and organizations have doing a lot of work to raise this issue. Hopefully we continue to see some positive change from that.
Yeah, sadly I tend to be an optimist, but this is going to be a really hard year. And the reality is it's already gotten hard. Out and about in the community, people are just more anxious, more stressed out. So that makes people more aggressive at times and more upset. And so there's a lot more de-escalation going on, even at food pantries and everywhere else we are in our shelters. And I think that that'll build as things get even harder on people. And I don't know what happens if people don't get food or SNAP or these types of things that look. I think we can rally a bit, but some of it's really big and very scary. And And I do agree that we'll keep doing our jobs and hope that we figure it out as we go along, but it's gonna be
Mhm.
very different.
Yeah, no, yeah, like I said, as deeply impressed as I was about Governor Hochul springing into action and Adam Bello springing into action with the SNAP stuff. Part of me is also like, oh, this is going to come from somewhere. This is, and of course there is flexibility and there are priorities and all things like that in the state budget, and that's really going to be like the tip report is one document that was always an annual highlight. The state budgets, that is kind of like my Super Bowl every year. And to read that thing when it comes out and see what legislative pieces got snuck in there and things like that, that's like always a big deal to me. In many years I testify at human services and or law enforcement, or public safety is what they call it. I've sat in those committees that are like when they're doing public testimony and you wait like 13 hours and stuff like, I've done that many times. And yeah, there's a lot of flexibility, people, but it's, there's is a finite amount of money out there. And I don't know how. And that's the thing. Everyone's so scared. Just nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. And to me, that's one of the things that's just been immensely frustrating is it's one thing if you say, okay, there's a $500 million budget shortfall. We have to close that. Okay, then that's at least a finite number and you can do mathematics. Something what that's ideologically based is a lot different because this isn't a mathematics thing. This is an ideology thing. And that's just a whole different animal, is kind of what I've observed this year.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. You can plan for shortfalls and things like that, but you know, even if you have a little extra left over, or you scramble a little bit more to find funds for one year, if you know that, your funds have been cut and are going to continue to be cut, or you just don't know,
Yeah.
your ability to help other agencies and other persons is going to suffer long term as well.
Yeah. And the whole not knowing, I mean, to what Andy was saying, that is just humans are not built to do well with that. We want to know stuff. That's one of the reasons why you know, we imagine stuff and we jump to conclusions that are incorrect, is because it's easier for our brains to know something, even if it's wrong, than to not know. And oh my goodness, yeah, that is a really good point.
I think I saw a question pop up in the chat about.
Yeah, I got one more and then we'll go there. Um, oh, yep, there we go. So if there was one budgetary cut or policy change that's already happened that you could undo, what would it be?
Just one.
Just one.
Oh, that's tough. I think for me, it'd be probably the broadest hitting one across the country will be the new SNAP requirements. I think are
Mhm.
just that's too much and too devastating to our communities. So that would probably there's a lot I'd like to talk about, but that's probably the biggest one.
Yeah, I think I mentioned. I mean, one that made me really upset was like the one about legal representation for unaccompanied minors. I
Mhm.
mean, that's just to me, I don't get it. Doesn't make sense to me. So, and it is very much related to human trafficking in the way that we see. Not only are they a huge at-risk population, but sometimes they already are victims by the time they're in that process. So, yeah.
I wouldn't even know where to begin. I honestly wouldn't. I mean, ultimately, I hope you all get your funding. I'd rather see you get it, before us. As much as I like to go out and get bad guys and stuff like that, at the end of the day, your ability to help these folks has got to be paramount. So, yeah, if I had a Christmas wish, that would be it. That you guys get your funding back.
That's, I mean, it's interesting because it's kind of, I'm going to say it's kind of full circle with that, is that, the not-for-profits in the not-for-profits in the community, like us and like Bright Star and like all these other ones who have done, you know, have do the work that we do. We've adapted, we've evolved in an environment, in a certain environment. And in that environment, it's one where there is a certain amount, maybe not enough, certainly not enough, but a certain amount of food assistance and a certain amount of subsidized housing and a certain amount of supportive housing and this and that. And it's like, this has been, real eye-opening to see just how that's what it really is. The whole environment has changed very quickly. And the stuff that used to be able to rely on, even if it wasn't relying on it for people we serve directly, somebody was getting it. So that meant there were, whatever the private sector could chip in, there were fewer people competing for it, this and that. It's now, that sudden change is also a very disruptive and very unpleasant and stressful thing. I'm a biology nerd and a bird watcher and someone who spends a lot of time outside and studying ecology and stuff like that. And yeah, just the whole thing about, we're adapted to an environment. And when there's sudden change, that's when bad things happen. That's kind of what it feels like right now. Um, so question from the audience. There was some mention of task forces like the Western District and North Country. Can you talk about the work that those task forces do and how task forces change when funding is removed?
Yeah. So with the Western District Task Force, like I said, that's the task force that for many, many years, that was the only funded task force in New York.
Hmm.
There's several regional task forces. There's Western District, North Country, Southern Tier, Capital Region. With the Western District, that was a task force that was able to have our actual paid coordinator position, which makes a big difference when you're trying to like handle referrals, coordinating meetings, and all of that. So that also allows us to have all these different subcommittees. So in the subcommittees, you have a law enforcement subcommittee, you have the survivor services subcommittees, we have a labor trafficking subcommittee, and particularly the law enforcement one, because like people that know about law enforcement know that like there has to be some money for resources to be allocated. Like it
Mhm.
has to be resources coming from somewhere. So there was dedicated staff from Erie County Sheriff. So Erie County Sheriff was part of the law enforcement component of that task force that had a dedicated position to help route any law enforcement referral. And that just made it incredibly effective to be able to reach someone almost immediately at any time for these referrals. And then with the law enforcement committee, they're able to coordinate among other agencies as well. So that's one of the things that I mentioned, like kind of immediately just gets affected. Like we're having meetings trying to continue to have some kind of a process to handle referrals, but chances are it's not going to be as effective as it could be without dedicated resources, without dedicated personnel. Um, and the North Country and all of that, these are task forces that haven't been funded in the past. So, organizations just get creative on how to collaborate, but it is just using staff time. It's staff like myself and staff from other nonprofits. We just put part of our staff time to help the work. So, as long as the task force is not funded, that's just how it works. Usually, it's nonprofits, nonprofit staff putting their time to help coordinate things. The North Country one, we run on a co-sharing model, so we can kind of distribute and then we have a steering committee, so we can distribute the labor a little even more. But we were just talking about how they literally just a couple of days ago put out some new funding opportunities for the Office of Victims of Crimes, who was what was funding the Western District Task Force, and there's our new funding opportunities. So they call it the Enhanced Collaborative Model. So that's what the Western District Task Force is one of the only in the country, and definitely in New York State, that has like enhanced collaborative model, which basically means having law enforcement, nonprofits, and like service providers are familiar with the region and with the clientele, collaborating to be more effective in helping victims of human trafficking. So that is a positive development that hopefully maybe the task force can be funded again, and other task forces could be funded. So.
Oh, that is a glimmer of hope. Thank you. And just something I just want to mention for anyone who may not have really thought about this is law enforcement, by the way by necessity, is broken down into jurisdiction. There's city cops and town cops and county sheriffs and things like that. And my goodness, human trafficking is not a crime where every piece of it is committed in one place. I know that with a lot of the sex trafficking on Lyle Avenue, you've got victims who are uh, first contacted and like from the counties, the rural counties that surround Monroe. So, because I mean, I grew up in one of those. They're not fun places to live, and they're some of the poorest places in New York State. Um, so yeah, it's a whole the collaboration is so incredibly important. And we can we can educate people in Monroe County and things but it's a lot harder for us for people to know about us 2 counties over. It's a lot harder to in counties that are incredibly just different, that are very low income, very rural, and there's sort of some cultural differences. They don't want to talk to people outside of their own community unless they have to very often. So yeah, those task forces, that was big to make these people all come and sit in a meeting together. That is huge.
Yeah, I preach a lot about task forces because human trafficking is a very particular type of crime where whether it's labor or sex trafficking, chances are the victims are not particularly fond of law enforcement.
Hmm.
So it's already very
You don't
difficult.
say.
Yeah.
Right. So, and if you look at the stats, most of the victims successfully escape with help from service providers more so than law
Hmm.
enforcement intervention. So that's why it's critically important to have, for the populations that worker justice serves, we have the trust with the community, we have the trust with the populations that we serve. Then we are able to be that conduit with law enforcement and say, hey, we're gonna be with you, and you're gonna be safe. And same thing when the people that are doing street outreach, they already built that relationship and that trust, with potential victims of sex trafficking. Same thing. So that's why the enhanced collaborative model has proven to be successful, and it's definitely something that I think we need to continue to really push for, because this is a very particular type of crime. It's not like other crimes. Sometimes the victims don't even know they're victims of this crime.
Hmm.
So I
Yeah.
think the collaboration with service providers is critical for that.
Yeah, I've been amazed how many people we see who are certainly not from Monroe County originally. Like all my documents are in Pennsylvania or, or in
Yeah.
one of the southern tier counties. And I've been through a ton of different state borders back and forth, and then eventually just kind of left out on Lyle. But, yeah, that task force model is critical because there are definitely no boundaries. And just the amount of transition we see, like weekly, there's different people,
Yep.
and that's pretty amazing too. The movement is just so rapid.
Okay. So anything else? Anyone want to throw anything else out? Oh, here we go. We got another question. Can you explain further about the budget changes you wish could be reversed? Andy, explain a little bit about SNAP, and Gabriel, what you said about unaccompanied minors having legal representation. Yeah, I've read about that, but I don't know how many people in the audience have.
Yeah, I can do the SNAP one real quick. So SNAP's always been probably one of the best economic stimuluses in all our communities. I think 98% of it is spent in the community, and what they're looking to do. So I don't have the data right in front of me, but it's a huge, I think Monroe County, well, I won't talk numbers exactly, but at age 55 and over until 65, there's an expectation that you'll volunteer or work 20 hours a week in order to receive your SNAP. And there's some workarounds around it and that kind of stuff. I think it worked out to like 11,000 people that would lose their SNAP benefits. Most of that, as we know, because we all go to the grocery store, doesn't even cover groceries anymore,
Mhm.
but is a necessary supplement. So if you're losing $280 a month in food, you're in trouble. And the reality is our systems aren't designed to have people volunteer 20 hours a week and monitor that, especially when you're talking thousands of people. And so it feels purposeful that sometimes that the policy, it's known that it can't be followed out on the ground. And so that'll cause just an immense amount. So that's a really big issue for me, that super vulnerable group. Not a lot of people over 55. I'm getting there. I'm right there, not easy to get hired real quick for 20 hours a week so you can get your food stamps, and then not easy to find volunteer positions for 20 hours a week that are something you could do. So I think that's a really devastating type policy that's the big one for me.
Have so because the first time I heard about this, and I've been in meeting, I've had people from DHS talk about this and talk about some of the workarounds, and they're actually
Yeah.
optimistic. To me, the cruelest part about this seems, well, a couple, but one of them is that most of the people probably do qualify for it, but it's a matter of reaching out to them. And a lot of these are the unhoused people and the people whose lives are just the most chaotic and going to be the hardest people to access. But yeah, a lot of not-for-profit folks in the community are kind of engaging in sort of dark humor about what we do with potentially all these unskilled volunteers. Like,
Right.
how many, do we get our office painted every week? What are we doing
Right.
here?
Yeah, well, I see, and maybe we will create some neat hubs, and maybe your volunteering job is just being out on your porch saying hi to people and making sure the neighborhood's okay. Who knows?
Well, yeah,
But
and that isn't the worst thing known to
right.
man either. I mean, that very well might be where some of this lands.
Yeah, I think
Um,
what worries me is the infrastructure for thousands of people. That's the trick is
right.
yeah, so
The other thing, I don't understand why counties aren't suing over this because this is a huge administrative burden. And I am not a lawyer. I certainly don't even know any lawyers who work at this particular level, but it just seems like something they should be suing over.
yeah, definitely.
I mean, that's also speaking of lawsuits, like that's one of the ways that with the unaccompanied minor thing. So I had like two unaccompanied minor cases last year of underage two girls that were essentially victims of labor trafficking, agricultural labor trafficking. So there's a program that it's an unaccompanied children's program that allows for these children to have legal representation, and there's different, not usually nonprofits that have this funding that can provide legal representation for them to have. Usually, it's a special juvenile visa if they're neglected or abandoned, which a lot of times just by virtue of just being an unaccompanied minor crossing the border alone is pretty much meets a lot of that criteria. So,
Right. One would
um,
think.
right. So, and then in March, the Trump administration just decided to cut that funding for like over 100 organizations. So And I think that might still be in litigation, but there was lawsuits on that because this is a program that's been operating for like over 10 years. And it's critical. I mean, the unaccompanied children issue, back in a couple of years ago, it was a lot in the news, or like actually last time Trump was, president, with like putting children in cages and stuff like that. But it's been an issue in this country for many, many years. So it just doesn't make sense to like cut funding for something like this. Is like so highly needed. There's like these are children.
Yeah. And Keith, you got a question specifically. From your perspective as a law enforcement officer, if law enforcement officers could get a funding dump, where do you think it should go to be most effective in identifying and serving victims? Patrol, training, intelligence, systems?
That's a great question. I think first would be to, supplementing the task force model. Um, like you said, that it's huge. Being able to sit down with folks, just having those connections, um, you know, meeting all you folks. Um, it used to be, oh, okay, this person may or may not be trafficked. Who do we call? Now
Mhm.
a lot of people know, oh, well, I'll call Keith Beer because Keith Beer knows who to call. You know what I mean? And that's from these kinds of relationships, and that's huge. Other parts of that would be definitely training. I think we need a lot more awareness for our first responders of all across, fire, EMS, police, our hospital staff, all of these folks, that see these folks on a regular basis, that see these victims and often just don't, put it together that that's what's going on, because it's not something that's on everybody's mind. If you're not trained to look for it,
Mhm.
you're going to miss it. And then the last part, yeah, definitely intelligence is huge in the sense that, you know, like we've all talked about, being able to get those numbers, getting a better idea, a grasp of how many victims are there, how are they distributed, who are our most vulnerable victims, and, how are we going to address these individual problems, you know, and ultimately, begin some type of investigation, because we got to know who it is first, you know. And if the victims aren't reporting, understandably, it makes it that much more difficult, because a lot of crimes, as we know, start with a victim report.
Right.
So we don't have that a lot of times, probably the majority of times in human trafficking. Um, so it's a much more difficult animal than we're
Mhm.
used to.
And it's the other thing with like getting numbers is it's very hard to motivate people to invest money in a crime when you've got just a tiny, tiny little when what's showing up on paper is a very small number of victims. And
Mhm.
that's I think another thing I really like about task forces and cross-sector collaboration is you can get people who see victims. You can get law enforcement people who see victims as part of their job. You can get service provider victims who see victims as their job. And everybody is talking to each, and then you can get night. And oh, look, we're not even talking about the same people. You've got a dozen, and you've got a dozen, and you've got a dozen, and okay, now all of a sudden you've got numbers that we still know are low, but they're getting closer. They're getting, and now you've got something a little bit better to report back and to tell funders and stuff. We have a clue about what the scope of the problem is now. We know it's still low, but we've got a clue now.
Yeah. I mean, and just convincing, our executive staffs in law enforcement agencies that, hey, this is a huge problem. And I don't know, there's been a disconnect there, I think, largely in law enforcement in Monroe County, um, to be able to understand, hey, this is a much bigger problem than we know it is. Um, So being able to get those numbers and being able to firm that up and be able to put them, kind of like the tip report, like we talked about,
Mhm.
it's one of those things that stimulates the conversation. You're able to put it down on somebody's desk and say, hey, this is what we're seeing. We need to do something about this.
Yeah, definitely. Well, folks, I want to thank you for your time and your expertise. And this was wonderful. I'm really, really grateful that we were able to all get together and educate the community and educate folks about this because this is so important. And hopefully next year you can never say a happy topic when you're talking about human trafficking, but at least the world is going to be a little less worried about whether or not the sky is falling. Okay, so we got another question. Um, okay, is there a difference between the classic idea of prostitute and trafficking? What is the pimp in the context of trafficking? Is Lyle Avenue looked at in terms of trafficking? Okay, I think all of us may have a slight be able to answer that question a little bit differently. I think if y'all want to take a stab at it, actually, since I'm talking right now, I'm gonna go first. So by legal definition, it's trafficking when force, fraud, or coercion is being used to extract commercial sex or labor from an adult. If you're talking about a minor, you don't need to prove it's just whether or not it's commercial sex. So, what do you see on Lyle Avenue? You will see a lot of people who will swear up and down that they are not being trafficked, that they don't have a pimp, that they are not being coerced. But very often, if you watch them, they're kind of looking over their shoulder and there's somebody kind of staring at them or acting all intimidating or something like that. And it's actually clear that they are. Or if you go and watch in the human trafficking court, you will see somebody who walks them in and walks them out. So there's a lot of reasons why people will deny that. Part of it is a lot of people aren't really clear on what that definition means. A lot of it is also people, the less, the more disempowered we are, the less good stuff we have in our life, the fewer assets we have in our life, the tighter we want to grasp at any modicum of control we have, even if it's only in our own minds.
Mhm.
So, yeah, they don't want to admit that they're in a bad situation. And these are also very often people who have been in bad situations their entire life. They're typically have experienced a lot of abuse in childhood. They're not used to healthy relationships. Um, so this is, so yeah, they may deny that and in any given moment, not all of them are being trafficked. The statistics I've seen are at any given moment, about half of them are, but most of them will be over time. They will, and even when I was doing outreach a million years ago, I remember one woman who's like, "Oh no, I don't have a pimp, no boyfriend, no pimp. I'm just out here by myself." And I'll take her at her word. She probably was, but like a year later, I was watching at the safe court, and there she comes with the guy and walks. And what's more, I know it was not a partner because he walked out. He walked in and out with like three other women, and it was such a glaringly there's no other context in somebody would do, acting like that. So it was yeah. So that's kind of where that shakes out. That's kind of how I would describe it. Anyone else? Who else wants to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I definitely agree, Melanie. We obviously the force, fraud, and coercion, but people automatically think when they're talking about human trafficking that it's, something that is, extremely organized, involves organized criminal organizations. It involves, transporting people from one place to another. And none of that needs to be true. Someone can be trafficked out of their own house. They can be
Mhm.
trafficked by a family member. In fact, I think it's 3/4 of known offenders are most likely to be family or somebody well known to the victim. I mean, it's substantial. Um, so having that, that mindset, and you kind of miss a lot of that. Um, so a lot of the folks, like you said, the street prostitutes that we see, even if they're, if they have a pimp that's using some type of force, fraud, and coercion, which they're pimps, of course they are, um, and forcing them to commit sexual acts, that qualifies. That is human trafficking all day, all long. So being able to understand that and, think in the context of, hey, this isn't just prostitution. This is a much bigger thing. And then trying to change attitudes about, sex workers in general. A lot of these folks end up in this life not through faults of their own, and you can't look at it like, oh, well, if they really wanted to get out, they'd get out, because, how much of that, traumatic bonding and, just situational and economic issues and things like that, that force them into that life and keep them there. It all counts.
Yeah, I agree. We just see a huge continuum, from, maybe it's your partner who's making you do it so you can both, get high, or, maybe you are out there for a certain amount of time working for a certain person and you better make a certain amount or you're going to be in trouble, that kind of thing. And then there's folks that just, that's the way it started, and now they're kind of out there on their own. Their mental health has gone so far south, and, things have been so bad that people no longer, use them as pimps or whatever. And those folks are now they're being coerced by their own addiction,
Mhm.
and like you're saying, and just being raised, and that's how you make money, and that's how it works. And so at one point in time, they were brought into that life by somebody, and yeah, and then so it just goes all through. It's amazing. Everyone you meet is just a little bit different or a little bit different circumstance, and but really being coerced. And if you're not being coerced by directly by another person, then it's the addiction and mental health issues. And
I mean, whether a pimp is always a trafficker. I mean, you gotta think about trafficking is used force for or coercion to profit from an individual, and sex trafficking will be in the using sex acts to profit from an individual. For there to never be coercion is very unlikely. So, like for a pimp to not at some point, be coercive and essentially be a trafficker is very unlikely.
Mhm. And a lot of times, there's subtle nuances too that people don't realize. You think, we have, a significant amount of runaways, for whatever reason, whether it's substance abuse or bad home life, whatever, especially among our LGBT community. We see a lot of young male LGBTQ members that come out and they get, thrown out of their house or whatever, or there's friction there, and then they're, unhoused. They meet, some older man, and the older man says, hey, you can come stay at my house. I'll feed you, but you're going to give me sexual favors. That's trafficking. Yeah, there might not be force for it, fraud, or coercion, but we don't have to prove that in that type of case. There's still some type of monetary exchange, or tit for tat, if you want, that this person is forcing upon this minor to commit sexual acts, for their gratification. That still qualifies as human trafficking.
Okay, awesome. Well, if there's no more questions, I'm gonna let everybody go and get their 10 minutes more of their day back. But thank you everyone for your time and sharing your wisdom and experience. This is wonderful. And like I said, next year, maybe not pleasant, but hopefully a little bit less fear, a little bit less panic in the room.
That would be nice. Yes.
thank you.
Thank you
Awesome.
very much, Melanie.
All right.
Appreciate it,
Yeah,
everyone.
thank you
Really
very
was.
See
much.
everybody.
Yep. Take care,
Uh,
folks.
See
Take
y'all.
care.
Take care.
Yep.